I tried to warn Mark that this room was going to be full.
You guys getting like different angles or something?
Not as a group.
Different organizations.
I have to leave it.
Maybe.
Anything else happening in the State House today?
Am I in your way?
The only place I want to be.
Good. Only at select board meetings. You have the camera.
We are going to call our meeting to order. And the first thing you all need to know is that our committee assistant will be looking to see if there's a larger room for us. Welcome to our new larger committee room.
You build it and they will come.
I guess so, that's the thing. We were just in 47 on another meeting. It was like, felt so big up there. Great, let's have our first witness, which is...
I think we're just
Yeah.
So, for the record, Matt Chapman, General Counsel with the Agency of Natural Resources.
John Groveman, Policy and Water Program Director for the Vermont Natural Resources Council.
So, we're here to basically begin the more detailed walkthrough of what Deputy Secretary Walk and Mr. Shoup sort of gave a sort of conceptual outline to the committee several days ago on the administration's proposal and VNRC's work on revisions to Act 250 that we all agreed upon. You'll find on the website a document entitled Matt Chapman and Act 250 Discussion Document. That's what I'm primarily going to be working from, and just to sort of explain, I'll take a minute or two just to explain what I tried to do with this document to help maybe walk you through and orient you to it. I hope it helps sort of segment things better so that it's easy for the committee to navigate their way through it. So what we basically did was try to divide the bill up into 5 sections, right? One dealing with the jurisdictional changes with respect to Act 250, one dealing with the changes to criteria, the third dealing with changes with respect to conditions in the permitting process, and the fourth related to changes to the board structure and conforming changes with respect to that. And then lastly, a set of miscellaneous changes in reports that are included in here. This does not contain all the conforming changes where District Commission was stricken to board, and there were a few technical or minor changes that were non-substantive that are in the 81-page draft that are not included in this document. So with each one of these sections, we divided it into sections based on topical areas and provided a summary of what that section proposes to do. Moving, if you want to start, just move. So there's a table of contents that basically provides an outline, the page number in the document where it's located at, and then the narrative sort of summary of what's contained within that. And hopefully that provides an overview so that committee members can sort of navigate their way through a fairly large document, hopefully easily. If you move to page 6, which is where the substance where we actually start, you'll basically see I'm very repetitive with respect to this. So what I basically do is in every sort of area, you'll see the summary again. This is basically just repeated in the outline. A citation and cross-reference to where the language you see below appears in the bill itself, and then the proposed language. So again, just for orientation purposes of what it is we're going through and how it's organized. So with that, so the first sort of larger area that we're walking through are the proposed changes to Act 250 jurisdiction. And the first change that we're looking at is one related to critical resource protection and looking specifically at Act 250 jurisdiction over ridge lines. And what this proposes to do is to expand Act 250 jurisdiction to ridge lines. And ridge lines are both a defined term. It's a defined term. It basically is you have to be at an elevation of at least 1,500 feet and within 200 feet of a ridge line, which means the elongated crest or series of crests at the apex or uppermost point of the intersection between two opposite slopes and the side of mountain, including all land. So what we are in the process of doing right now, and we haven't completed it, is working with our GIS unit at the Agency of Natural Resources to map these features throughout the state. We think that we can do it, and we think we can provide a good map. I think the question we're looking at how good the detail is and whether it's more of an advisory type mapping or whether it's more granular than that. So I'll just sort of pause for a second. This one's relatively straightforward, and just ask if anyone has any questions before I move on to the next.
I'm curious where you got your definition of ridgeline. Has it
So,
been used elsewhere?
So the definition came from Brian Shoup, who in his previous career was a planning consultant, worked with towns throughout the state on zoning bylaws and wrote many ridgeline zoning bylaws. And so based on that work that he did and some research into how ridgeline was defined in bylaws, the definition was, I think, refined a little bit, but that's basically the foundation for where the definition came from. And I guess kind of zooming out a little bit, I would just say that as we go through this, I hope this will all be familiar to the committee. What we tried to do was track the bill and the issue. So a big issue in the committee bill was ridge lines or 2,000 feet jurisdiction or 1,500 feet jurisdiction. So we had a lot of discussions about what is the appropriate elevation to have active jurisdiction. And we looked at maps and we looked at, you know, how much land would be pulled in under each of the ideas and what really would meet the goal of protecting these sensitive resources. And so this is where we landed, was defining ridge lines that were above 1,500 feet. And the maps that A&R is creating, and they'll be available at some point, people will be able to see for themselves, you know, what is included, what's not included.
So it's from the top of the ridge line down 200 feet on ridge lines above 1,500 feet.
Correct.
Got it. Any other questions on this committee? Representative Miller.
And does this ridgeline discussion then clear out the other discussion of whether Act 250 should be, other than agriculture and forestry, be moved from 2,500 feet to 2,000 or to 1,500?
Yeah,
Does this preclude those?
Yeah, this was in lieu. So as I was saying, that this is our proposal to address the committee discussion of
That whole-
1,500 feet,
Yeah.
2,000 feet. There was discussion about ridge lines, if I
Yeah,
recall.
there was.
Yeah. So this is our proposal to deal with that issue.
Is there space behind you for more folks to sit down?
There is room for a couple people if they want to stand behind John and I. We pulled our chairs forward, so.
Or if there were folding chairs.
I think all the folded chairs are out.
Maybe we could move forward and people could sit on the sill.
Oh yeah, that would be
Okay.
good. That would be good. That's a good idea.
Trying to think how to use this.
No.
Goodness, we at least have an emergency exit like this.
Yeah, we've exceeded the state limit.
Why do you think agriculture?
I don't know how the systems work.
Well, I think the policy discussion, tracking what the committee talked about last year, was that over 2,500 feet, ag and forestry, you're at a very high elevation, so you're pulling in everything. I believe the committee discussion last year was even at 2,000 or 1,500 feet, it would be development other than ag and forestry. So we basically, we're tracking that. I think the concern at that level is commercial and residential development. Yep.
So what you're proposing, I understand that if you were logging under 2,500 feet but over 2,000 feet, you would not require,
Right, not for
Any
logging,
action.
no.
Correct.
or farming,
Or farming.
no.
in farming you take in like maple syrup production.
Nothing that met the definition of farming.
Correct.
And that would include any ancillary buildings, especially in the, like, in February, there's all kinds of buildings in the woods now that run arrows, you know,
I
just
think you would-
base construction.
Because if it's related to the farm.
Right, you would go back to the definition of farming in Act 250, which looks at ancillary structures associated with the farming activity.
If they're part of the silviculture and agricultural activity. That's a good question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's page one.
Yeah, right. So now we move down to letter B. Now we're looking at jurisdiction over fragmentation. And this is proposing to amend Act 250 jurisdiction to include basically new road construction of a certain length, looking at small, and basically we, based on the committee's concerns, felt that small-scale development has the potential to fragment intact forest blocks or protecting habitat, and if that development encroaches far from existing roads, then it, Act 250 triggering is warranted. So if you move to the language itself, what the bill proposes is that any road or driveway greater than 2,000 feet would create Act 250 jurisdiction. It does not include municipal roads, state roads, roads used exclusively for forestry, or roads used exclusively for agriculture. So those are exclusions. It does include upgrades to like Class 4 roads by a private person for the purpose of accessing a development or subdivision. So it's, again, I think it's trying to look at previous iterations of jurisdiction of Act 250 and hopefully address some of the issues that they had by making the road longer and hopefully providing some degree of clarity around it, but also get to some of the issues I think that the committee was dealing with respect to fragmentation and habitat connection. This seemed to be a proxy for creating jurisdiction to address some of those issues that made more sense than, well, that was easier to implement than some of the alternatives that were being considered by the committee last year.
So again, the long discussion you had last year about different ways, there seemed to be, the committee, I think a majority of the committee felt that there should be some jurisdictional trigger to address this development in these sensitive areas that could fragment forests and habitat. And a number of mechanisms were discussed, from forest block mapping to different sort of tiers of jurisdiction. And we talked about all of those things.
Right.
And looked at different maps. And this is a mechanism, it worked differently, but as Matt said, this mechanism used to exist, this jurisdictional mechanism. So the proposal was this would be the clearest way to deal with this jurisdictional issue, bring back that jurisdictional mechanism, but improve it and learn from what some of the problems were. And that's where there was a lot of discussion about including driveways, which was previously in the previous iteration of this jurisdictional tool, not part of it. What's the length? So we talked about that, and certainly that's an area the committee should explore in terms of, you may hear from other witnesses about what is the proper trigger for all of these things. But that's how we that was the process we went through in trying to design this.
Any other?
Can I ask a question? Well, just Class 4 roads, they're municipal roads, and you're actually having these changes applied to Class 4 roads.
So it only applies to a Class 4 road when a private development is going in and upgrading that Class 4 road so that it can be used to access a subdivision or development. So it's a fairly limited inclusion of municipal roads where there's an agreement between a municipality and a private landowner to upgrade that road to access a development.
And that development could be a single house.
It could be
Yes.
so this is not a subdivision based, it's a length of improvement based. So moving on to the next section, this talks about Act 250 jurisdiction in certain downtown designated areas. It really focuses on two designations, designated downtowns and neighborhood development areas. Both of these are served by municipal water and sewer, governed by local bylaws that deal with a number of different issues. And I think folks when we went through this, thought that it was appropriate that Act 250 jurisdiction not extend in these areas. There's a lot of changes in here that relate to how do you deal with previously permitted projects in these downtowns, and basically those permits continue to live until there's a new development. And when that new development takes place, so if you're renovating a building that would trigger municipal zoning or potentially an Act 250 permit, or you're doing some upgrades to the site, there's an opportunity as a part of this process to basically have the Act 250 permits incorporated into a municipal permit, and then the board would basically release jurisdiction over the Act 250 permit. So the issues are covered, but they get incorporated into municipal permits for those previously permitted projects. I think the other thing that's maybe just important to note with respect to this, the administration is making an effort to try to include all Act 250 proposals that might be out there in this bill. So we're not, so if there's, say, for example, a set of housing proposals, and that is the example in this one, that we want to have changes to Act 250 to either clean up errors or improve housing issues. We've asked that those get reflected in this bill so that the committee and everyone has sort of an understanding of all of the issues with respect to Act 250, and that they're not sort of popcorning around in other bills throughout the legislature. We obviously can't control what the legislature chooses to do, but we're trying to make an effort to coordinate that. So there's a couple of these as we go through. I'll note they're a part of the housing proposal.
Thank you. Representative McCullough and Smith.
Matt, there has been a bill for several biennia for how do we get out of Act 250 when it no longer applies to the project because of change of use or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That hasn't moved. This is sort of the flip side of that, and I think we may. I mean, you've just told us a previously permitted project will, should this pass, Act 250 project will no longer be under the auspices, if you will, of Act 250, but we may need specific language that says that. Maybe there is in here.
Yeah,
There is.
It would be under the auspices of the it's a transfer really. It's a
Okay.
transfer of jurisdiction to the locality that is in the neighborhood development area or the neighborhood development area or the downtown, because they have to have zoning and subdivision bylaws that meet a certain standard to even get those designations, and so they would then administer their permits.
So good. That's
That's the idea.
Yeah.
But it's very technical, and there was
Yeah.
Right.
a lot of time spent on trying to get this right. Hopefully we did.
So the first set of changes deal.
Oh, sorry, Representative
Oh,
Smith.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, does this include some commercial growth areas as well, or just residential growth?
So both designated downtowns and NDAs, I believe, they're village center designations, and well, I shouldn't say village center. They're areas that have been planned and approved by the state downtown board as where growth is going to concentrate. Is that a fair?
There are two of the
Designated
several center programs.
I think Chris could probably answer.
Yeah, I was
that.
going to say, Chris is the expert on
Yeah,
this.
thank
Thank you. Chris Cochran from the Department of Housing and Community Development. Yeah, to answer your question specifically, there's opportunities for growth within these areas. What the proposal does is exempts the downtown centers, which are commercial cores, and the surrounding neighborhood areas from Act 250. It's agnostic whether the development is commercial, residential, or whatever the type is.
So it would clearly include that, commercial and.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay. And then I have another simple question, and that is, on the sentence you have starting on line 21, they are served by municipal sewer and water and governed by local zoning board and that are robust and promote smart growth. Is there a legal definition of robust?
We'll get to it. So I think the effort in trying to summarize it is that there's a review a fairly robust review that takes place by the downtown board over the municipal planning and zoning in these designated centers, and the review in these two particular designated areas is more robust than what takes place, for example, in the village center designation. So I think it's saying that these two, because of the level of review that takes place by the downtown board, they deserve this treatment, whereas I think additional work or study may need to happen with the other emerging town center, village center, and other designations before you extend this favorable Act 250 treatment to those.
So I get the concept, but I'm still not clear. What level is robust?
I mean, it's really, this is a descriptive, the criteria in the law now about, and we could go, that we could submit that to the committee. You could look at what the criteria are. You can get testimony from Chris and Kate McCarthy from VNRC. And it's a good question.
Sure.
But there are existing criteria in the law that you just have to meet to get these designations. And it's not, it's not unduly difficult in our opinion, but you have to show that you have zoning and subdivision bylaws in place that are going to be meaningful enough that you could get the benefits of these designated areas, which would, if this bill passed, would include exemptions from Act 250. So there are already benefits that you get. So to get those benefits, you have to meet certain standards, and now we're adding a benefit, right, to that, which would be exemption from Act 250. But I would encourage you to take specific testimony on what the criteria are
For those designations.
Yeah, and have that discussion.
Okay, we have a long bill to get through.
I know, but related to this, this is important in my district, is a path forward for designated villages and how they too could take advantage of an exemption if they can, have a path forward on the type of criteria that they need to comply to achieve the same objectives of concentrated development in downtown areas, villages.
Sure, and I think that the reason the administration is comfortable with this is that village centers can use the NDA process to get that designation if they're willing to go through the sort of review and planning process to get designated as a neighborhood development area.
Thank you.
All right, so moving into the actual language itself. So this is proposing to repeal the current it actually moves, I believe, the definition of permanently affordable housing. These changes with respect to the affordable housing are a part of a cleanup, correct? With respect to the definition or how affordability is calculated and there were some issues where housing that is actually sort of above market or not affordable was being considered affordable housing for purposes of this treatment. Is that a fair? And so this tries to adjust some of the criteria for how affordable housing is statutorily determined, so that we're not counting housing that is not affordable or is above market as affordable. Is that a fair enough description, Chris? Okay. So that is really the changes that are sort of in this first change with respect to permanent affordable housing, mixed income housing, rent and rental housing, and how the calculations take place. And then, so moving on, if you get to page 11, where you see the amendments of 6081P and O. This is where you're getting to the, these are the exemptions from Act 250 for jurisdiction in neighborhood development areas and designated downtowns.
Representative McCullough.
I'm not seeing growth centers here, and was that an oversight, or we're dealing with them differently?
No, so the exemptions only apply in designated downtowns and neighborhood development areas.
Right.
Not in growth centers and not in new town centers or village center.
Right.
Thank you.
Chris wants to clarify.
If I could, Chris Cochran, Department of Housing and Community. Growth centers and new town centers can achieve the neighborhood development area designation on top of their existing designation. So there is a place for them, but it's through the NDA designation.
Thank you.
And then a number of these other changes are basically to make modifications with respect to both the prior. So there are three things that are sort of working in concert here. There's the priority housing. Several years ago, you made changes with respect to priority housing and giving favorable Act 250 treatment with respect to that. There are changes with respect to affordability, and there are changes with respect to Act 250 treatment in downtowns. This is getting rid of some of the requirements with respect to what Act 250 does, with respect to the downtown development areas and findings when it goes through and designates for the priority housing as well. So that goes away with this new status under Act 250, these set of findings, because these areas are now exempt, they go away. So that's the changes you see on page 13 and 6086B, eliminating that section.
Yes.
For the record, Peter Walk, Deputy Secretary A&R, those do remain in effect for growth centers.
Centers and
for the other
right
centers in which they apply. Just want to make sure we're clear on that.
Thank you.
So the changes on page 16, this is with respect to, again, changes with respect to affordability and making the changes to improve the affordability section. And then on the bottom of page 16, this is the change with respect to previously permitted projects and their treatment under Act 250. So it is a section that applies to previously permitted projects located in a downtown district or neighborhood development area, and that they have applied by a permit for a permit or a permitting amendment through the zoning regulations and bylaws. And basically the appropriate municipal panel reviewing can eliminate or merge the Act 250 conditions based on any of the following being the case. So it lists a series of functions that may have previously been in an Act 250 permit. So like if it was a construction phase and it's been completed, those conditions can be eliminated. If it was a requirement to be in compliance with another state permit that has independent jurisdiction, those conditions can be eliminated or merged. If the issue is addressed by the municipal regulation and the project will meet municipal standards, then those Act 250 conditions can go away. So it sort of lays out the criteria by which the appropriate municipal panel looks at the project, looks at the Act 250 condition, and makes a determination of whether it can merge into the municipal permit or not. And then I think the other thing that's important is it requires sort of an enhanced notice process with respect to these decisions at the municipal level.
So we want to, basically the theory is we want to make sure that if we're going to merge a condition that is covered and that people know about it. I mean, and so we try to work those criteria to suss that out. You know, when can we confidently merge them because we know it's covered by the local permit, and I think the notice is fine. I think, you know, that's pretty clear. So
Right.
people know about it.
So the rest of the changes in this section are basically conforming just to clean up the statute, to basically clarify that the the sort of the process on how these get merged into permits. So I'm just going to pause. There's a lot in there before we move on and see if there's any questions.
Representative McCollum.
They're gonna determine whether or not they can be merged.
Correct.
Right.
What happens if not?
Then they basically, those conditions would be part of the they would stand alone, right? They'd become part of the permit basically, and they would be administered by the appropriate municipal panel, but they
Okay.
wouldn't go away.
Right.
Right,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
so the administration of them
Yeah.
would.
By merge, I guess
would
it's like
pass,
they'd be
yeah.
otherwise covered, so either they're otherwise covered
Yeah.
by a condition in the permit, or because it's no longer applicable, something's happened, it's like one of the criteria was about the construction phase of the project, so
Right.
obviously you don't need to put that in and have a zoning administrator say, oh, do I have to do anything with that? They don't, obviously.
Okay.
But either it would be, go away, or it would live in that permit and then be administered and enforced
Okay,
by the municipality.
thank you.
So the next change is with respect to transportation projects. And this proposes for state or municipal transportation projects to change how jurisdiction is calculated. So if you're on page 21, and going on to page 22, basically, with respect to state projects, there's a jurisdictional threshold of 10 acres before Act 250 jurisdiction applies. What this proposes to do is say that if you're a state transportation project or a municipal transportation project that is federally funded and complies with an MOU between the Agency of Transportation and the Agency of Agriculture on prime ag soils to make sure that there aren't ag soil issues associated with the project, and also with respect to a memorandum of understanding between the Agency of Transportation and the Agency of Natural Resources on fisheries issues to make sure that there's not an issue with respect to fisheries, that you can deduct the previously disturbed area from your 10-acre calculation. And previously disturbed is a defined term that is the change by the previous installation of transportation facilities, including roads, railroads, runways, trails, sidewalks, ditches, drainage features, ledge removal, utility work, clear zones, or other similar features associated with such facilities. So the concept is, if there's a highway out there that's already disturbed a certain area and impacted a certain area, that it could be deducted and not go through Act 250 review as a part, or you could deduct it from your 10-acre jurisdictional threshold for consideration of Act 250 review.
Right, it would still go through Act 250 if even
it's-
with the deduction, you triggered the 10
Correct.
acres, yeah.
Is there a sense of how many projects like this happen in a given year or timeframe? No
So,
timeframe?
so just before that question gets in, I don't know, and that's a good question. And so I just want to say, for the record, this was one of the harder provisions to draft. And I appreciate, I think VNRC's agreed with this concept that you could deduct the acreage of previously disturbed area. But, up until the final drafting, we still really want to hone in on what is previously disturbed. And so we're going to still talk with VTrans and get some examples, and I figured the committee would have the same question. So I think it would be good to get examples of what this would exempt, or what this would apply to, and how it would work.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Right, and I think, and I'm aware that VTrans is in the process of basically kind of be able to come in and tell the committee where they've had problems with respect to this, and then give you examples of how it would work, what some of these features are, give you some real life examples so that you have something more tangible than what you see here.
Cool.
Can I just add, Billy Coster, ANR, this would not apply to new exits on
Thank
the
you.
interstate. So if you were to propose a brand new exit, say in Bolton, even if it was involving previously disturbed areas, that it would not benefit from this consideration. So those would have the full traditional Act 250 jurisdiction applied to them.
And that is only for brand new interstate exchanges that,
Will that carve
is
out?
anything else carved out?
That's the
Anything else
one
new,
that.
like,
Well, I mean, the discussions we had were, clearly if you're, if it's new construction, if you're adding lanes, if you're moving the entire highway, because those are the, the things that have been in Act 250 over the years, where Act 250, I think, has played an important role. I can think of two different projects, where there was a moving of the highway, and it was enough acres to trigger the 10-acre threshold, and this would not apply to those projects. But as I said, it's still not clear exactly what would it would apply to, and I think that's a good question, and so it'd be important to get those examples and just fully understand this.
we'll get examples. Great.
Yes. So as you move down the page, section 4, this is a new requirement that the Secretaries of Transportation and Agriculture, Food and Markets have an MOU to deal with prime ag soil issues. And what's there as Sec 5 is a revision to the existing memorandum of understanding between the agencies of natural resources and transportation to include fisheries issues when considering that.
So this MOU exists today for both of these?
The ag one does not. They don't have a sort of working document to deal with prime ag soils. And really what this is trying to get at is those situations. If there's ever 10 acres disturbed, that the Agency of Transportation and Agriculture are working together to ensure that there's conservation of those prime ag soils, so that the jurisdictional trigger effectively remains for purposes of protecting that particular resource or function, regardless of whether we're talking about previously disturbed. So that's at least conceptually what the Agency of Transportation and Ag had proposed. With respect to the stream alt, yes, my understanding there is an MOU, and we have a consultation process with the Agency of Transportation over any encroachments into rivers and other sort of impacts on water bodies. We think the fishery program actually gets involved in it anyway, but just in sort of an abundance of clarity, we're going to ensure that fisheries is a function that gets, because that was one that was flagged that potentially is not considered in the broader reviews that VTrans does for environmental issues.
So the idea is to capture, even if you're backing out acreage and then you don't have Act 250 jurisdiction, where without this proposal you would, things like ag soils and fisheries impacts, you might lose that review, because Act 250 provided that review where A&R permitting did not, and ag does not have an independent prime ag soil protection program. So it's basically as a backstop, so to speak, to add those considerations in, even if you're not going to trigger Act 250 anymore, under this provision of backing out the acreage. That's the idea.
Is there a consideration for swimming holes?
So technically speaking, I don't think you can. So I know there was a historic issue with respect to a swimming hole and a VTrans project.
But that was one of the examples that so that was one of the two examples I was thinking of. So that project, I think, would still trigger Act 250.
Right.
Because it was new, they were basically building an entire new stretch of road. And then the swimming hole was mitigation for wetland impacts in that particular case. So that was something that project would still trigger.
250 jurisdiction.
Yeah, but there's no provision specifically, so this is aimed at the transportation projects. But that's a good question, and that was sort of the back and forth that we went through, and VNRC didn't want to agree to anything that would result in a project like that not being reviewed and those impacts being allowed to occur. And I think that the language is narrowly tailored enough to not have that happen, but that's where the examples come in, to just make sure we understand what is no longer going to be regulated, which was previously regulated. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
All right. So moving on to the next element, this is an expansion of jurisdiction near interstate exchanges. And I think the committee talked about this last session. Basically what this proposes is that within 2,000 feet of an interstate point of access or exit, that the construction of commercial or industrial purposes, improvements for commercial or industrial use, are subject to Act 250 jurisdiction, unless there's an sort of expansive planning process that exists that a town can show that their municipal zoning meets this series of planning requirements, and that review takes place by a regional planning commission and is approved. Then the circumference of jurisdiction can be decreased or eliminated. I don't know if there's any questions with respect to that. All right, moving on. So then the next, we're sort of moving on to a different area. Now we're talking about changes to Act 250 criteria. The first set of changes are a change to floodways and flood hazard areas. Basically, this proposes to modernize the definitions of floodway and floodway fringe to flood hazard area and river corridor, which is effectively how the agency has participated in Act 250 projects, and how the Act 250 has basically looked at these terms. So basically, what you see on page 25, you see the elimination of the definition of floodway and replacement of flood hazard area, and that's cross-referencing back to our regulatory authority in section 752, and then changing the definition of floodway fringe to river corridor, and again referencing back to our regulatory authority. And then you see a change to the Act 250 criteria in criteria 1D.
Can you just comment? I mean, the first
Oh,
ones
absolutely.
they're in our draft bill.
They are.
I think calling those out.
I was right to say, I think the changes that you see before you in these sections are identical with the changes in your draft bill. So same with the changes to the criteria with respect to floodway. So it basically changes it to flood hazard areas and river corridors and expands it to not just inundation but fluvial erosion as well. So that's the change with respect to that. The other sort of aspect associated with this, again, trying to get at the committee's desire for addressing sort of critical resource areas, is a change to how ANR's flood hazard area permitting program works in its jurisdiction. And so what this proposes to do, and again, we're on page 27, this changes ANR's authority with respect to our flood hazard area permitting program. It requires us to adopt by rule something called highest priority river corridors, which are river corridors that provide critical floodwater storage or are in highly vulnerable areas related to erosion. So the program is participating in a functioning floodways process right now to basically look at floodways that act as storage during significant rain events in hazard type times. And they're going through a mapping process or beginning a mapping process now. That mapping process should be complete by 2022 and would serve as a basis for a sort of expanded permitting program jurisdiction. The other proposed change with respect to this is that, and this change is on page 29 at the top of the page. You'll see that beginning by November of 21, we would propose to expand ANR permitting jurisdiction to areas that also require a permit under Act 250. So right now, if you have Act 250 jurisdiction, ANR would comment on your project with respect to its potential impacts on a flood hazard area or fluvial, with respect to fluvial erosion or river corridor related issues. This would basically say, in advance, you need to come in for our permit, and that permit would then go into Act 250 and serve as a rebuttable presumption of compliance with the criteria. And part of this is frankly to enhance our permitting capacity internally, but also I think it's easier for both the agency and I think applicants to deal with A&R sort of in a permitting type context, to deal with the issues, and then those issues can come into 250 that way. Peter, you wanna? Okay, cool.
I'll just add, this is how we currently deal with wetlands and stormwater in the Act 250 process. We analyze those permits, we issue them, then district commissions consider whether those permits are sufficient to address the criteria.
Does this effort preclude the enhanced designation process that was a criteria before? Are
You mean
we
for critical
replace-
resource areas?
Yeah, that one.
Yes.
Thank you.
So what we tried to do was to look at some of the major elements that the committee was looking at with respect to enhanced designation and critical resources, and see whether there was a way that gets at the issue the committee was trying to resolve in a manner from a permitting perspective that we thought was easier to administer. So these sort of aspects with respect to ridge lines, fragmentation, and river corridors are all an effort by the agency and VNRC to come up with an alternative to that critical resource approach that addresses the issue but does it in a different way.
Yep.
I would just say, I agree with what Matt said, but it's not only easier to administer, but I think more targeted. So I think it's a big step forward to have a river corridor permitting program at A&R. It's something that has been talked about ever since Irene. And really the issues are development in the river corridor, and the Act 250 criteria, as you know, are very broad. It could be traffic, it could be aesthetics, it could be issues that just really are not really what you're looking to get at. And so I think it is a positive step to have A&R having a focused permitting program, which it doesn't have now, over that development, and then to expand it over time. I think that's where we need to go in terms of protecting these resources. And then, as Matt said, the ridge lines, the additional jurisdictional trigger based on driveways and roads. We're going to get to the forest criteria soon. And there are all ways to try to, listening to the conversation about critical resource areas, that they were all designed to try to get at those issues.
In your opinion, do you see this as a step forward in terms of providing consistency and predictability in the process when it comes to these criteria?
I mean, that's been, I think, a dual goal of provide more protection, and of course, you want something to be clear. I do agree with Matt. I think there's been, and Greg could speak to this better than me, but there've been a number of cases at the District Commission and on appeal dealing with the floodway criteria over the last 5 to 10 years that I think there's been confusion about the way that criteria was written in terms of the Secretary identifying the floodway fringe and things like that, where this does clear, I think,
I think
those issues up.
I certainly think that it makes Act 250 consistent with the operable technical methodology that A&R uses. We don't use words like floodway and floodway fringe anymore, right? We've moved on beyond those terms. All right. So the next proposed change is to Criterion 5, transportation. This is the committee's proposal. It basically takes the pedestrian elements and creates a criterion. It adds bicycle, pedestrian, and transit infrastructure to the things that you need to look at as far as not creating unreasonable congestion or safe conditions. So again, this is directly out of the committee's bill. If there's any questions. All right, the next change is to development affecting municipal and educational services. So this is with respect to Criterion 6 and 7. And basically what this does is there's a criterion that requires that there be no unreasonable burden on educational services or the ability of local governments to provide municipal or government services. This basically says if If a municipality is asked whether there's an impact and they fail to respond within 90 days, there's a presumption that there's no unreasonable burden. There's a question with respect to that or not? Moving through. So the next change is with respect to forest blocks and connecting habitat. So these are changes to Criterion 8. So this basically adds in definitions of what constitutes connecting habitat and forest blocks into Act 250. These are very similar to what the committee worked with last year. Then it proposes changes to Criterion 8. The way I drafted this is slightly different than what the committee did last year. What it basically does is create a Criterion 8A, which deals with scenic beauty, aesthetics, and historic sites. Criterion 8B that deals with necessary wildlife habitat and endangered species. And then if you go to page 32, sort of on the bottom, you'll see that there's a Criterion 8C that deals with forest blocks, connecting habitat, and rare and irreplaceable natural areas. And with respect to those rare and so it's a no undue adverse impact standard. And if the project is proposed results in adverse impacts or undue impacts, then it can only be granted if effects are avoided, minimized, and mitigated in accordance with rules adopted by the board. And we'll get to the rulemaking at the end, and we can walk through what the sort of standards are there. But it sort of it changes it, and the reason I organize it differently is because of the next section with respect to the burdens of proof. There was a desire to basically have the applicant bear the burden with respect to necessary wildlife habitat and forest blocks and connecting habitat, but we did not want to shift the burden with respect to aesthetics and the rest. And that's generally consistent with the way the committee approached it last year. I drafted a little differently because I thought it was clearer. But I defer to Ledge Council as to where they want to go with that.
Can I just ask a question about
Please, yes.
Rare irreplaceable natural areas?
Yes.
The definition of those?
What's been,
I don't think, it's been in the law since the beginning. I don't think there's a definition.
There's no
definition.
of,
Case law.
It's through case law. I think that's one of the things we've learned and what we've done with the forest block and connecting habitat is you can define those terms. And because we have so much case law on rare and irreplaceable natural areas and necessary wildlife habitat, actually, which is defined, necessary wildlife habitat is defined. I think that we feel that the regulated community understands, what those resources are. But yeah, we're defining the ones that we're adding for protection, which has been discussed for years in the legislature, in this committee. And yeah, and this is a really, important step forward, as you all know, finally getting this criteria, clarifying the burden of proof to be consistent with how the burden of proof works for almost all the other criteria, and defining the terms, and then having the rulemaking, which we could talk about when we get to that section, but it'll help provide that guidance and clarification for avoiding and minimizing and mitigating, which doesn't exist now in a rule, and we think that would provide clarity and provide an opportunity to have a public discussion about how the program is going to work.
All right. So the next section is public investments and how public investments are protected under Act 250. This 9K. So if you look at page 33, this proposes to add lands conserved by VHCB, lands or facilities receiving benefits through VHCB as sort of protected under this. The committee went further and included a number of tax and benefit designation programs. I think when we started running through how that would actually get implemented, we thought it was better to just leave it silent and allow Act 250 to sort of evolve and progress the way it historically has, rather than expressly enumerating those in Act 250. So, if anyone has. So the next change is climate change. So this basically makes a couple of changes to address climate issues in the context of Act 250. And there are really two changes that are proposed. One is a change to Criterion 9F to basically clarify with respect to energy conservation that in order to meet the criterion, you need to conform to the stretch code for residential buildings if you're a residential building. So this requires the stretch code. My understanding is right now, practically, that is how virtually everyone complies with 9F anyway.
But not commercial.
There is, well, the commercial stretch code is more complicated. There is, so, and it's probably better if someone like Greg, who has a little more understanding with respect to this commercial stretch code than I do, walks through that.
Okay, so Greg Boble, Natural Resources Board General Counsel. Yeah, so currently, you could see the current language of the statute refers to 30 VSA 51 and 53. 51 is for residential code, 53 is for commercial code. 51 within itself has a mandate to create a stretch code for Act 250 projects, and 53 for commercial buildings. There's no equivalent mandate for the creation of a stretch code for commercial building. So for the past number of years, it's been the procedure of the board to work with DPS to create a stretch code using best available technology, which is the test in 9F, as the standard for the commercial stretch code. That's the way we've been dealing with it in the past. So there has historically, at least for the last 5 years or so, been stretch codes in practice for both commercial buildings and residential buildings. The board actually the Natural Resources Board just voted today to not implement a new stretch code for commercial buildings because, at least one of the reasons, is that there's a new base commercial code that's expected to come out within the next couple of months. I think it's going through the LCAR process now. And it's the board's understanding that that code will significantly increase the requirements for commercial buildings. So they didn't see a need to have a code that went beyond the base commercial code.
Could you refresh my understanding of the definition of a stretch code?
Yeah, so it's relatively straightforward. The DPS is required to create a base code for both residential buildings and for commercial buildings. The stretch code is just a code on top of the base code that requires further efficiencies.
So is it fair to say that it would be more strict?
Yes. Yeah.
And is it fair to say that this new language is really just
That's
reiterating what's already happening and what's already in the statute?
I think so.
Representative Terran.
Is it fair to say that this will add more cost to residential home builders and commercial builders?
This proposal will not. This proposal is essentially adopting current practice.
So the next proposed change is adding a Criterion 9M, which is looking at climate adaptation. This requires buildings or subdivisions to employ building orientation, site and landscape design, and building design that basically take into consideration the effects of climate change. So this is more of it's more adaptation than it is sort of prevention focused, but it tries to incorporate those concepts into Act 250 and have that sort of design review take place as a part of the Act 250 review and approval process.
Yeah,
Out of curiosity, how can you give an example of how building orientation?
Sure. I mean, I think I think the first thing you think about with respect to building orientation is how you orient it with respect to making it solar ready or available. I mean, that's I think the easiest. Yeah.
Sure.
But that's less adaptation than it is energy use, probably.
Right.
For that one, yeah.
Right.
Cool,
But
that's a
it
new
could
one.
provide you an opportunity to respond to if you lost power during a flood event or something.
Right.
You provide that ability to be resilient. So it could be named climate resiliency as well.
Yep, and it might get people more able to have solar. Representative McCullough.
The committee has been considering under climate adaptation other arenas such as transportation opportunities that could ameliorate climate issues. Did you guys
Jim,
look?
can you speak up? Yeah.
Yes. So the committee had been considering other climate adaptation, including transportation, that may ameliorate, if enacted, climate situations. Are those considered later in this, or is this it for climate adaptation?
So, I mean, this was a really difficult issue, as you know, having grinded through it in committee, to talk to. We talked to a lot of different experts and work on climate, and, a lot of the concepts were just hard to implement and administer through Act 250, and we considered lots of different things, and I encourage you to take testimony from people who work on climate, in a focused way, and test some of the ideas that you had. But we kind of ran into roadblocks in terms of how it would work, how it would be administered through Act 250, and then even some of the things that were considered by the committee last year. And Greg mentioned that the commercial code is being upgraded. We've been told that a lot of those mechanisms are going to be in these new codes, in terms of the EV stations, in terms of what's going to be required of different developments, in terms of using renewable energy. And so we didn't want to be redundant with that. And I think I learned, I think that there's been a lack of information about this code, these code improvements, and I would encourage you to take testimony on that, and just find out, nail down exactly what those are. So that's kind of where we landed, but we had a hard time trying to figure out how to write this into the Act 250 and in a way that would really work for the program. And
transportation was just one of them. Building envelope, as far as thermal efficiency. Now, that could be in the previous paragraph under stretch code for residential, and I would be adding commercial.
Yeah, and maybe the commercial as well. Those are the type of things we were hearing are going to be covered in the new commercial code, and which has a broader reach than just Act 250.
Thank you.
But I mean, I encourage you to delve into that.
All right. The next change is consistency with local and regional plans. So this is very similar but slightly different than what the committee proposed last year. The language itself is on page 35. It basically requires that the plan be approved pursuant to the approval process for it to be considered under Criterion 10, and that if it's approved, that the board require conformance with land use maps in the plans, and that they should not apply a provision that a reasonable person of ordinary intelligence could understand.
That's a legal case standard. That's everybody understandably always says, what the heck does that mean? But that's case law. It's basically just being codified.
The next section 8, it changes, and I can't tell you the history around this one, but the plan for municipalities used to, it was permissive as to whether it was consistent with the goals in the end of Chapter 117, and this requires consistency with those goals. So we're moving on to a new topical area. This is really getting into permit conditions in the Act 250 permitting process. So the first set of changes, this is somewhat part of permitting, somewhat part of a change to how the board will operate, but this proposes for major Act 250 permits to have an advance notice of those permits, much like the advance notice process in Section 248 that the Public Utilities Commission uses. It requires the public and affected agencies, as well as municipalities and regional planning commissions, to receive notice as a part of this, and it authorizes those entities to hold a public informational meeting to talk about the project, and requires the applicant to basically address or respond to comments or issues raised by in the context of that public informational process. Right. That's okay.
I just want to note, so this is something that's been talked about for years in the legislature as part of Act 250, having a pre-application, it's been sometimes called a scoping process, to allow, before you get into the formal process where everybody sort of kind of solidifies their position and they have to argue their position formally, could have this sort of pre-notice of the application, understand what the project is, have a less formal, completely informal conversation with the applicant, try to address issues before you get into the process. So I think this is I think this proposal will really benefit the whole process, and municipalities and citizens who want to participate, who, they're not putting the application together, right? That you're always reacting to this application that just kind of comes at you, and so this would allow for that sort of a better notice and an opportunity to talk with the applicant. And the better applicants, have always said that they want something like this because they could resolve issues up front rather than fighting about them through the process. So I just want to note, I think this is a important improvement.
So again, just to sort of amplify this, this does not apply to administrative amendments or minor amendments designated by rule by the board. So minors and administrative amendments, this doesn't apply to. So the next set of changes are the ones that took us the longest to get to, and I'm not sure that we're actually there yet.
We're not.
Okay, we're not there yet. These are conditions with respect to rural economic development and forest processing. And we couldn't reach consensus, so I guess I would say we're fairly close, and I think we are endeavoring to continue to have a dialogue, and I'm happy to walk through what's in here. I think it's probably worthwhile if the committee would indulge me to kind of breeze through this. I think the major issue is that there's some, with climate change, there are some issues with respect to how forest processing industries work, and a need for flexibility to work outside of what people would consider to be normal business hours because of the need to work when the ground is frozen, when weather conditions permit. So this is trying to give some degree of more flexibility with respect to forest processing industries to do that type of work. I think we have substantial agreement on those issues. It doesn't take away the standards under the criteria, but it does allow some balancing to the impact of the business when you're looking at those criteria. So the way the board reviews criteria with respect to hours of operations conditions at forest processing facilities would change somewhat. So that's sort of, I think, the issue where we have agreement on it. The issue we're close to having agreement with respect to delivery of wood heat fuel. So again, and I think a sort of real life example is the National Life campus doesn't allow delivery of pelletized wood during sort of the normal daytime hours. what we're trying to do is make sure that if the place they're buying their wood fuel from, we don't want them to have a condition that basically says they have to have their deliveries between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. and National Life says, well, you can't deliver any sooner than 9 p.m., right? And so now what happens to those trucks? Do they just sit and idle on a road? How do we not create problems between different permitting jurisdictions?
Is that really an issue? Like, if you get fuel delivered to your house, you can come anytime?
Right, I know. And so that's, I think, the concern, and I think that we will find a way to.
Has it been an issue?
I don't know. Is it Peter? If
I understand it's been an issue. I think we can have Fourth Parks and Rec or other folks come here and talk about specific issues. But yeah, it has been an issue we want to address.
Delivering pelletized fuel.
Having the issues associated with hours of operation impact the ability to deliver fuel when it's needed. We don't typically have those restrictions on other fuels as they're needed to be delivered when they're needed to be delivered.
So this also addresses hours of operation of the facility supplying
that's
the
what I was
fuel.
remembering.
So it's the truck. I mean, I think it's more.
Storage.
It's more about the trucks leaving the facility that's creating the fuel, be it chips or pellets.
Right.
And I would just, I mean, there's a draft that's out there, you could read it, we weren't able, I think the issue is, from our perspective, is just wanting to, provide some fair mechanism for these uses to occur by narrowing the criteria at play, but, which are things like noise and trucks and things like that, so how do you deal with that, even if it's for wood heat, and that's one issue, and then the other issue has to do with ag soil mitigation, and on all these issues, I think VNRC reached a point where we agreed that we should provide some accommodation to address them, but it was about the mechanisms and how far they would go, and we just didn't reach the final agreement. So I would just suggest on these issues, hopefully we'll agree, we'll keep talking.
Yep.
But if we don't reach an agreement, you could take testimony and, you make a decision, obviously. Like, you're gonna make a decision on all this, but you can hear from everybody, you'll get all the information. But we're gonna continue to work.
Right.
And try to reach, from our perspectives, agreement on this, to give you that information. And that's where this one, I think, is at.
Yep. So I am now going to sort of move through this and on to page 40. This is, and I think Peter spoke to it, this is the change with respect to A&R permits and the presumptions in Act 250 proceedings. And what this does is it doesn't change the weight by which Act 250 permits receive. There's no change in the weighting of presumptions.
You're clearing the place out.
I know. It's so enthralling.
We're just letting one person in.
When you get to industrial parks,
I know, everybody, it's enthralling.
I was anticipating more oxygen, actually.
I know. So the presumptions, basically what it does is that currently the board has to adopt the presumptions by rule. This just basically says all A&R permits receive a presumption under Act 250.
This is the one just making consistency among the newer permits from A&R.
Right, and frankly, preventing or not requiring or nudging the board every time the legislature decides to expand permitting jurisdiction or authority to amend their rules. I mean,
Okay. And we were going to try to get a list.
So I can provide the committee assistant. I have a segment of the board rules and the classes of permits that are exempt underneath it. I did it kind of at the last minute, so I apologize, but I can provide that to the committee. And then I can also forward a copy of all of the permits that A&R issues. Industrial parks. So this basically clarifies the master planning process and how fees can be resolved at industrial parks. This is in the committee bill as well.
I mean, it came from the recommendations of the working group.
Right.
I don't remember enough pages here.
It was not, okay.
It was in the administration.
It was in the administration
Yeah.
bill,
It's in 197.
but it was not in the committee bill. So I don't know how much detail you'd like to go into this.
It came from this working group that this was their recommendation after meeting, right, to
Yes.
discuss addressing industrial park issues. I think it's a fairly narrow.
Yeah, if I may, really what it does is it clarifies that there is an incentive to do upfront resource assessment and planning at industrial parks and to obtain a master permit. And then as you're building out the individual lots within an industrial park, if you've done that work up front, there can be very little cost and very little process associated with the construction of the actual individual tenants. You front load that review, and then when you actually construct, it's easier, faster, and less expensive. It's not a requirement. You don't have to do it this way. It's just making it clear that as you're planning a park, it's available to you.
It's very consistent in
It's how, master permits are issued at ski areas, large residential phase developments. It just allows you to do all your due diligence up front, and as you're kind of building individual buildings over time, that work has already been completed.
I guess I thought we already had that. So does this change the fee structure or what?
It clarifies all of it.
If I may, the vast majority of this change, the vast majority of the language that you're seeing in this proposal is not new. It's been clarified, and the provision doesn't apply solely to industrial parks. It's to master planning generally and to fees generally. I think there was, when this study group occurred a couple of summers ago, I think there was a little bit of confusion amongst developers of developers of industrial parks and municipalities that there was a master plan process available to them. And so the idea behind these changes is to just clarify how to go through the master plan process, what the benefits are about upfront planning, and hey, by the way, if you plan well upfront, there might also be some fee implications for you going forward when you choose to build out your master plan.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right. So we've now hit sort of, I think, the larger spot. So with 10 minutes left, do you want me to dive straight head first in?
I do.
Okay.
We may go over, and hopefully that's okay with our next witness.
Okay. So the next series of changes are.
Is that okay with you, Annette?
Well, I'm a little concerned about my drive home, because there's some snow in the forecast. But,
Yeah.
if you guys want to keep going, but I don't.
We need to keep going. We got to hear it.
An hour? I mean, half an hour? It seems like you're even halfway through the bill. So just, can you give me a read on it?
How much time do you think we'll take?
I think I can try and pick my pace up if you want. I think that it really depends on the level of questions the committee wants to ask. So.
Well, a lot of the changes at some point get to just kind of conforming changes.
Yeah, and I will try and really rocket through those.
Yeah.
So
there are dozens of pages that really.
That I think we can brush through quickly.
Don't read though.
Just sign.
Yeah, just sign here.
We got this.
All right. So
that didn't come out right.
So let me just sort of step back, give a quick overview of what this does, and then we can dive into the language. So what this proposes to do is it creates a professional natural resources board that consists of a chair and 2 permanent members. And then there are basically 2 rotating members that we're calling regional commissioners that come from the area where the project's being proposed. The regional commissioners sit on the board to make factual findings, but the members basically need to have experience in land use, natural resources, economic development, or environmental justices or racial equity areas. The bill also directs that the governor, when he makes appointments to the board, consider gender, racial, and economic diversity in the context of the appointment process. So those incorporate a lot of things that the committee was looking at last session and incorporate them into this bill. The chair and permanent members are independent. The structure basically is designed to be insulated from political interference. The chair and the 2 members are selected using the Judicial Nominating Committee. Board members, including regional commissioners, serve 6-year terms, and are all of them are only removable for cause. And they're generally speaking subjected to increased ethical standards. So there have been some changes to address changes that are taking place in the board with their electronic structure, but basically administrative districts, which are district commissioners, make decisions with respect to jurisdiction, whether applications are major or minor, and issue permit decisions and amendment decisions.
So that's actually just the district coordinator.
Excuse me, sorry.
That's important.
With respect to district and make decisions with respect to major or minor permits. So backing out. So basically, a lot of the function that takes place with district commissions right now would take place by the coordinator. And then the board itself has original jurisdiction over major permit applications. Major applications would need to be heard in the location where the project is located. Hearings need to be open and accessible to the public. The board would also have original jurisdiction over revocations and appellate jurisdiction over jurisdictional opinions. Downtown board designations of designated downtowns and NDA designations. So those two new enhanced that get you out of Act 250. Act 250 can hear appeals from the downtown board with respect to that. And then also approval of RPC approval of municipal plans for purposes of Criterion 10. And then when rendering a decision, regional commissioners are voting members on all factual issues, but not with respect to Act 250 policy issues. They're there to provide local perspective with respect to Act 250. And then finally, appeals from this new enhanced board are direct to the Supreme Court. So it basically takes that sort of direct appeal route to the Supreme Court from the enhanced natural resources board. So I'm just going to start progressing through the language right now. So the page 46, this basically is the nomination process for the chair and members. A talks about how the chair is nominated and confirmed. This language basically is, I believe, it's very similar to what's in the committee bill. I stole it from the Public Utilities Commission. This is how the Public Utilities Commission members are nominated and approved through their process.
Can you say it's in our bill?
I believe it's not identical. It's awfully close. I think that did you use the exact PUC model when you were doing the appointment process in the committee bill?
I don't remember.
I know. Right. So it's there may have been some modification that the committee made to it during your testimony process, but I think that this was an effort to try and adhere to an existing process.
If I could just, on this one though, so there was a lot of discussion in the committee last year about, when we talked about the verb, about making sure that that it wasn't a the insulated from politics the board would be, and that a big part of that is what's the appointment process. So and then I just want to reiterate, as Brian Shoup said last time, this was an issue that VNRC really wrestled with, this change to the process. But some of the reasons why we we came to the conclusion that this could be an improvement of Act 250 is that if you have a board that's truly insulated from politics, so there's removal for cause, there's the judicial nominating process. That's one of the aspects of this, that you could really have a board that is functioning independently, reviewing Act 250, and then I'll talk about the other issues as Matt gets to them. But then obviously having the regional participation on the board it was vital to us to have them join in. Those folks are not appointed the same way. There's a different appointment process for those commissioners. It's really the way they're appointed now.
Correct.
But you have the core of the board that would go through this more intensive appointment process and would only be able to remove for cause. And I think only the commissioners can only be removed for cause.
Correct.
As well. So, but we just keep moving. There's a lot to this. So, but yeah.
Representative McCullough.
Line 1, the board with a capital B shall consist of a chair. 2 members and 2 regional commission members. Now, what I'm thinking I've understood from our conversations earlier, the 2 regional commission members are various participants. They are members of the capital B board, but they come, say, in this particular instance, from District 4, in another
Yes, they
instance from
change.
District
It
5.
depends on where the
So
project is.
they
Yeah.
rotate through.
Yeah,
as
it depends on where the
appropriate.
project is, right?
Okay, good.
Yeah, so that's the regional perspective. So if you're in District 4, where you're from,
Yep.
you'd have those
Yep.
2 people joining the 3, and they would hear the case.
Good, yep, thank you.
All right. So this basically talks about the appointment process with respect to members. When you get to page 47 with respect to members' criteria, so when making appointments and considering appointments under this, both the governor and the legislature are to give consideration to their skills in environmental science, natural resources, law and policy, land use planning, community development, racial equity, and environmental justice, and also give consideration to the overall membership of the board to ensure that there's an racial, ethnic, gender, and economic diversity associated with that board. So that's very similar, if not identical, to what the committee looked at last year. So as you go down on line 11, that basically ensures that the chair, 2 members, and the regional commissioners can only be removed for cause. On line 13, this basically, and going on for a ways, this basically deals with what happens when someone is participating in a case and either their term expires or they retire, right? So this deals with how those cases get dealt with as a part of the process.
It's basic, boilerplate language, basically.
It is.
Yeah.
So that basically runs on to page 48. I would just say at the top of page 48 on line 3, this makes it very clear that the chair has general charge of the offices and the employees of the board. Line 13, this basically allows the board to use hearing officers, so the board can appoint individuals to conduct proceedings and then issue a proposal of a decision that then goes to the board for their ultimate consideration and review. And this is, I think, this was in the committee's bill, and I cut and pasted it verbatim with respect to this. Moving on to page 49. So this is a change to the board's existing rules of procedure. It clarifies that when they adopt those rules of procedure, that the board has to make reasonable efforts that the processes maximize pro se participation.
So just that was an important provision from our perspective if you're gonna have basically one proceeding at this board, people come without lawyers, that there's a charge in their rules to make accommodation for that, and to be able to deal with the participants who may not have lawyers in the process.
And I guess
That's what that means.
so that their rulemaking would go through regular rulemaking?
It does.
Yeah.
That would have a public process to review it?
Yes.
Correct,
Yeah.
yes.
And then what's just cause and who decides and how does that happen for removal of the board?
Well,
so you can for cause.
So just cause is normally you need to have you're not an at-will employee anymore. You're a for-cause employee, which just basically means that there needs to be a grounds upon which you're removing someone from office.
You have to do something, just like in a personnel case, like
right.
The fireable offense. You can't remove somebody if you don't like them, or her, or you don't like the decisions that were made.
How does it happen? To the Senate or the governor?
It's up. There are processes set up through the human resources departments to basically deal with what constitutes cause and how for cause proceedings are dealt with.
Okay.
It's a high bar. You have to mess up pretty badly.
All right. So the next change, and you should fully consider this, is a proposal to take the existing 9 districts and change it to 6. This roughly corresponds to how coordinators are currently reviewing projects, roughly. The next set of changes on page 51, this goes into the powers of the board. If on page 51, and this is a fairly long section, starts on line 10 and moves for several pages. This particular provision authorizes the board and the agencies that normally participate before the board to basically bill back their costs to an applicant. This is the same sort of practice that exists in the public utilities. So it allows them to either hire experts or have their staff costs covered by through the process. And it allows board oversight over that bill back process. And that goes on through page 50, sort of the bottom of page 52, on line 19. So this basically says that the board has the powers of court of record. So it's has all of the powers of the court of the state of Vermont. On page 53, line 3, the board is required to allow all members of the public to attend its meetings unless it's for the sole purpose of information to be treated as confidential. And it also lays out a number of requirements about public accessibility of the hearings. Again, this is to try and make sure that the board ensures that the meetings are open and available to the public, and the public can participate in the process. Line 10. So this is basically language that exists with assistant judges. So assistant judges are fact finders in the superior court system, and this basically talks about that concept and brings it over to the regional commissioner process. So it clarifies that that. Am I in the right spot? Wait a second.
Yeah.
Yep.
You
So as you move through there, you're basically talking about we're talking about questions of law and questions of fact and mixed questions. This is basically talking about the board and and how regional commissioners participate in the fact finding process.
Representative Dolan.
Is this considered quasi-judicial with ex parte communication?
Yes. I mean, it's a quasi-judicial process.
With ex parte?
Anytime you're talking about a
Apply.
quasi-judicial process, ex parte prohibitions apply. So just trying to move through there's a series of a fairly substantial series of conforming changes. When you get the next sort of more substantive changes are on page 56. This is talking about basically so you'll notice everywhere in this bill that district commission is struck, board is put in. Much like if you look at anywhere in a lot of other statutes, authority vests within the secretary. In this case, it vests within the board. This clarifies that the board has the ability to delegate functions down to district coordinators with respect to process. They already have the ability. There's a statutory section that wasn't changed that authorizes district coordinators to make jurisdictional determinations. This also says that they make determinations as to whether applications are minor and certain majors. They make permit decisions with respect to potentially with some minors, with minors and minor amendments and administrative amendments. And then the board can delegate any additional authority to a district coordinator that the board deems necessary for the effective administration of activity.
I just want to pause there because I think this is important, based on some of, what I've heard about this part of the proposal. So approximately 80% of applications are minor applications right now in Act 250, which means that they don't get a hearing. Right now those minors are issued by the district commission. Under this proposal, what this provision is saying, district coordinators would issue the minor permits. Right now, the district coordinators draft those permits, and then they present them to the commission, and the commission could make changes, or they could just sign them as they are. So this is basically saying that the vast majority of applications are still gonna go through these regional offices, and the decision's gonna be made by the district coordinator. Also, the coordinator decides what's a minor or a major. And the board is gonna hear major applications, and those are defined now as applications that get a hearing. So that's not changing either. So I just wanna put this in context, so at least everybody understands what the proposal is. So I don't, I don't believe it eliminates a regional role or regional focus. It changes it for sure, and I'm not trying to diminish the change. I'm not trying to diminish that this is a significant alteration from the way things have been done, but most applications are gonna go through the district offices, and they're gonna be processed by the district coordinator. Decision's gonna be made about what's a major. If it's a major, it's gonna go to the board, and then the board will be joined by the 2 regional representatives to hear the major application in the town where the project is located. So then you're going back to the region, the project's still going to be heard in that location. So I just wanna make that clear, so like people understand like what the intent of this is and what the language actually says. Cause I think it's important, and people, there'll be some people who will support this proposal and some people who will oppose it, but I just wanna be really clear on kind of what the regional role versus the role of the new board would be. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about it as you delve into it.
Representative McCullough.
Thank you. This is not to discuss whether the greater idea is a good idea. It's only to discuss the language that I'm looking at. Line 3, the capital B board may delegate the authority to the district coordinators for whether it's a major or a minor, and that's not what I'm hearing you say. It looks to me like this is a top-down delegation made by the capital B board, which in this case would not be having the benefit of the 2 district coordinators. So am I reading this wrong?
It's a great point. So we talked about this a lot. My understanding is that this is a drafting protocol that this is, and maybe Greg could speak to this.
I was going to say, I think, so if I could just move to the next section, I think this sort of clarifies why the change, why that is the way it is, and I also think it's, obviously this is one of those issues that if the committee wishes to work its will and say either mandate that decision get made, obviously that's when you can. I think the next section, there are a couple of changes. The changes are related to the electronic means by which applications are both going to be received and how notice is going to go out. And I think the board there's 2 reasons for the May. One is that because all of the applications are now, by the time this becomes effective, are going to be going in through a central filing system, I think that there's some desire to make that language permissive to look at how that gets reviewed. So I think that's why the board made the recommendation. So this was at the recommendation of the NRB.
Right. So I just want to, just Representative McCall, I've raised the same issue throughout the draft team. This you should hear from the board about the new electronic filing system and the rationale for it. But I believe I've been assured that this is going to be delegated to the district coordinator. But every time I see the language, I say the same thing that you just said.
Matt, put a red flag on that if you would, because we will be discussing it later, and, so that the committee can have a better understanding of that particular sentence.
Sure. I am just, there's a series of.
Carol, do you have a question?
Quick question.
Sure.
If, once that decision is made, whether it's major or minor, can anyone appeal that decision?
Yes, it's an appealable decision.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
To who's the appeal?
To the board.
Right, so the decision as to whether it's major or minor is appealable to the board, and the board can also, and this is why I think it strongly implies that it is going to be delegated. The board can make its own decision, so it gets copied on the applications, it can make its own decision with respect to whether it's a major or a minor.
Irrespective of the district commission?
Yeah. So if the district commission says,
Coordinator.
or coordinator, excuse
Yeah.
me, makes a decision that it's a minor, the board can say, there are novel issues of policy or law that require this one to have a hearing needs to be held on it. So if you get to page, so there's a lot of technical changes. As you get to page 58, the next series of substantive changes come into play. This basically says, the section that I just referenced, the board treat the application as a major. The hearing's required to be held in the municipality where the project is located unless everyone agrees to a different location. So if the parties all agree that it's more convenient for everyone to hold it in a more central or different location, that's acceptable. And when conducting these hearings in any pre-hearing conference, the board is directed to require reasonable flexibility with its rules of procedure and of evidence to maximize pro se participation while also ensuring fairness in the proceeding. So in other words, be flexible with non-represented parties, but not to the detriment of anyone participating in the process such that it's unfair. So the next set of changes is on page 59. There's a change that allows the board to deny an application without prejudice if an applicant fails to respond to an incomplete determination or a recess order within 6 months of its issuance. So right now, the board's kind of limited in how it can deny applications. If no one fails, if the applicant basically fails to respond to the permit, this allows the board to deny it. And then it also makes it just very clear that when reviewing applications, making a final determination, that administrative districts are required to apply precedent from the board when making decisions on minor applications. Section 6089. So it sets up appeals of certain actions to the Natural Resources Board. So jurisdictional opinions are appealable. Determinations that applications are minors or administrative amendments by district coordinators are appealable. The determination by a regional planning commission with respect to Act 250 jurisdiction under that radius for interstate exchanges is appealable. So there's a set of planning findings to reduce it. If someone disagrees with that, they can appeal it to the board. Determinations by regional planning commissions that a municipal plan is consistent with the regional plan pursuant to section 4350 is appealable to the board. And then lastly, appeals by the downtown board with respect, or designations by the downtown board for downtown development districts and neighborhood development districts are appealable to the board. Basically, those appeals are de novo and need to be brought within 30 days of the decision. And then appeals of board decisions on permits are appealable to the Supreme Court. So there are certain minor actions appealable to the board. Decisions of the board with respect to permits are appealable to the Supreme Court. And we actually made it all the way through. The next set of changes are pretty straightforward. I don't know that we want to necessarily go through them line by line. This basically goes into Chapter 220 to make conforming changes to the existing appeal structure to the environmental court to basically expunge the Natural Resources Board out of the appeal structure before the environmental court. And that goes on for a while. But I wanted to have it in here so the committee could see what's going on. That gets us to page 70. So this it creates so this does a couple. There are two studies here. One is a planning study that really looks at a lot of the capabilities and development related issues that the committee spent time with, and said that, and basically directs the Natural Resources Board to make a decision as to whether the capability and development findings should be incorporated into and codified so that they're not in a session law from 1973, whether they should be updated, how they should be used in the context of Act 250, whether we should create maps with respect to the capability and development findings, and it asks to basically review how regional plans are reviewed and approved, and how that review and approval is conducted. And whether designations of growth centers and new town centers should be appealable. So there's a series of planning issues that were sort of left unresolved, but additional work needed to be done on them, and this makes a set of recommendations for a report to do that work.
So just to pause, so this is very important to VNRC, and there's a lot of discussion in the committee last year about those issues, and so this study, in our mind, you know, it's a meaningful step, and it really needs to be to look at how to infuse these planning principles into Act 250. We recognize there's a complexity to it, and people had questions about what some of the changes would mean and how it would work if we went and back and really brought life into the planning principles that were in Act 250 from the beginning. So we look at this as study as hopefully something coming out of that where people can get information about what the impact of these changes would be, answer people's questions about you know, what the changes would mean, and hopefully get a consensus around these issues to come back with a bill next year to actually implement these provisions.
All right. The next study is looking at how A&R permits are reviewed. This basically tells the Agency of Natural Resources to come back with both recommendations on presumptions in Act 250 and how the Environmental Division looks at A&R permits. So conduct a stakeholder process, bring in external parties, and come back with a set of recommendations for next year. The final section is with respect to transition and effective dates. So this basically has the two studies and the rivers changes taking effect on July 1 of this year. The remainder of the act taking effect on November 1 of 2022. Except that the authority to make appointments to the board shall take effect on, you know, effectively as soon as possible, and that appointments shall be made before the beginning of the next legislative session. That the authority for municipalities to request modifications to the zones around Interstate shall become effective so they can begin that planning process before the full bill takes effect. And that you basically the review of those gets tolled until such time as the full bill takes effect. And it puts the staggered nature of terms in place for each of the initial appointments for the board members. And it basically says that any existing district commissioners continue to serve until such time as all the permits before them are resolved and what resolution means. And then lastly, with respect to rulemaking, it requires that the new board adopt rules of procedure that take into account those pro se provisions and adopt rules with respect to critical wildlife or connecting habitat and forest blocks, and how applicants can avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to necessary wildlife habitat, forest blocks, connecting habitat, and rhinos.
Easy.
There you go.
So
Simple.
basically, the timing issues we discussed, and it would be interesting to see the committee discussion is you got to have the board in place in order to create this new system. So the first thing is to get the board members appointed, and then they have to adopt rules, and then they would create the system, and that's the reason for the length of time. If you're going to do something like this, obviously it needs to be done right, and so that's the kind of the stepwise.
Okay, thank you. This was, represents a phenomenal amount of work, I know. So thank you for your effort.
You're welcome.
And this was a great presentation of it. And I think you've given us the next level. You started last week with Intro Basics 101. This is sort of a 200 level. And I think as the committee discusses this, we'll dive into the actual language in the 300, maybe even get to the 400 level. But thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, committee, we're half an hour behind, but I do think we're due for a 5-minute bio break, and then we will start promptly at 3 o'clock. 4, 5, 6. Jim, we're going to get started. Representative McCullough. All right, we will call our meeting back to order.
My name is Annette Smith. I'm Executive Director of Vermonters for the Clean Environment. I'm here to thank Madam Chair and the committee for hearing my testimony.
It's
Yeah,
too
at
loud.
least the.
We can hear it.
The windows open really help. So the good news is I'm not going to comment on everything you just heard.
On the what?
On everything you just heard, but my comments are relevant to what you just heard in some places.
I mean, we were one of those open, didn't we?
Yeah, those are great.
Oh, that's what you want them closed.
No, leave them open.
Open, please.
I was thinking I should have worn my bathing suit.
Yeah, really. And your oxygen
That
mask.
would change the tenor of
Dive
everything.
So for those of you not familiar with Vermonters for a Clean Environment, we're a grassroots citizens-based organization. And we've been involved in state regulatory processes for 20 years. We've assisted Vermonters in participation in Act 250, Agency of Natural Resources, and Agency of Agriculture permit proceedings. And for the last decade, our focus has been at the Public Utility Commission. So we have a lot of experience with the type of professional board that's being proposed here. No other organization has the depth of experience with citizen participation in Vermont's regulatory processes as we do. In our experience, it is Vermont citizens who are the front lines of environmental protection. We were not included in any discussions about the Vermont Natural Resources Council Scott administration proposal. Today, I will respond to the VNRC administration proposal to eliminate district commissions, provide my constructive ideas about how to improve that proposal, and briefly discuss mountain protections and Slate Quarry regulation. So I'll end my testimony leading into your next agenda item. In 2003, I conducted focus groups around the state with citizens who had participated without attorneys, pro se, in Act 250 proceedings. To a person, the citizens expressed overwhelming support for the district commission process as the place where citizens can be heard and have their interests addressed. According to Bruce Post, who's researched Vermont's environmental history, Governor Dean Davis was inspired by the vision and commitment of local people to their homes, communities, natural environment, and their willingness to tackle issues. Out of that grew the concept for the district commissions. Apparently it was intended to be like a conversation among interested parties akin to what happens in a country store around a table or a wood stove in winter. In Governor Davis's environmental message to the state of Vermont 50 years ago, he said this about state and local governments. I hasten to point out that I do not advocate that all decision-making should be concentrated in one agency in Montpelier. Here is an opportunity for us to apply our creative localism theory, and by utilizing local government, regional planning, and development commissions, and a few strategically located districted state offices, we will have people located in various districts around the state They can then work directly with developers, communities, and other individuals to help eliminate or implement our environmental control programs. He said that 50 years ago to a day last week, January 8th. I was surprised by the idea that Act 250 can be improved by eliminating the best place for Vermont citizens to protect the environment at the regional level. If you think the Agency of Natural Resources is protecting the environment, in my experience, that is not the case. ANR is in the business of issuing permits, often with conditions that allow pollution, and the agency views its customer as the regulated business community. And I'll note that ANR doesn't have a public process. You can file comments, but whatever comes out of ANR, like MOUs, is not developed with any input from anyone but the agency and the applicant. And we see this a lot at the Public Utility Commission. ANR has fine scientists committed to protecting the environment whose opinions are often superseded by political interference. For specific responses to the proposals about ANR, I recommend that you take testimony from John Brabant, VCE's Regulatory Affairs Director, who worked at the agency for 25 years, and he can speak to the specifics in the proposal before you. The purported reason for eliminating the district commissions and shifting hearings to a state-level board is inconsistency. We have seen no data or evaluation of this claim. And even if there is inconsistency, that is one of the beauties of the Regional Act 250 program. Each region of Vermont is different, and in my work I have observed that every town has its own personality. Nobody knows better how to address issues locally and regionally than the people who live there. Building community is all about building relationships. There is no reason to think that having a state-level review process will result in consistency, and in fact, given the very different regions in Vermont, consistency is not necessarily a worthwhile goal. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said, consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. I am concerned about what is happening right now with the Natural Resources Board's merging of district commissions, cutting staff support, closing regional offices, and soon to be implementing a major change to the program whereby the central NRB office will receive all applications and assign them to district coordinators purportedly based on workload. This means that a project in the Northeast Kingdom might be handled by the Springfield district office. This would totally eviscerate the existing and important accessibility of the local offices and staff to both the permit applicants and the affected citizens. Most Act 250 applications are handled as minors, and citizen participation is at an all-time low. The ongoing erosion of Act 250's regional offices is very disturbing to see happening. And I'll give you a specific example that I'm dealing with right now regarding what I heard about the proposal for minors and hearings and going to majors. There's a proposal by Green Mountain Power in my town to do something with a distribution line, and it happens to be in a very sensitive ecological area. And it was proposed to go through as a minor. And so I reached out to the Green Mountain Power person, the point person, who turns out to be a retired district coordinator. And I said, well, I've got all this information that I gathered in between 2000 and 2004 about this area, about the hydrogeology, about the herpetological species, and I'm concerned about what you're proposing, and you need to know about what, this is a sensitive karst aquifer. And they promised to get back to me, and they didn't get back to me in time for us to avoid me asking for a hearing. Now, this is not Vermonters for a Clean Environment, it's just me personally, and I'm concerned about the issues in my town. And so I was advised to ask for a hearing. Now, this is a case that if it gets a hearing, doesn't need to go up to a major and go to a board. It can perfectly well be handled, and they ask for a stay, which is fine, and they may drop it, they may come back with a different plan, but in any case, I'm concerned about what I heard about, if it's going to be a major and it has a hearing, then it goes up to the board. There is a role to play for district commissions on minors, because every minor does a public notice and they have the opportunity to ask for a hearing. And this is a minor issue, but it's also a very important issue that should be handled locally. So there's this just, if there's a hearing, send it up to the board. I think that's that's one of the examples I can give you of it being not necessarily a good idea. Updating Act 250 provides an opportunity to solve longstanding problems. One problem is that district commissioners are appointed by governors who go to their political parties for names of people to appoint. Now, I've observed this phenomenon regardless of who the governor is or what party they represent. They actually make phone calls to the sitting representative in the area and say, give me names. And so I recommend establishing standards for appointees and for finding some way to insulate the district commission appointments from politics. And I notice in this proposal that I just heard that that's exactly the process proposed for what are called regional commissioners. I just told Matt Chapman, you have to change that name because I served on the Rutland Regional Planning Commission for more than a dozen years and I was a regional commissioner. So if this is a board, then they should be regional board members. But it's a minor comment, but still, this is why this proposal needs work, and it would have been nice to have been included because I would have saved the committee's time by getting my ideas inserted into this. Another problem with how the district commission process has evolved is when parties lawyer up, turning what was intended to be an informal process into the equivalent of court. And this leads to the argument about 2 bites at the apple. One of the big cases that I can point to is there was a proposal for a quarry in Moortown. It first lawyered up at the DRB, then it lawyered up at the Act 250 District Commission, then it lawyered up at, I don't know if it was the Environmental Board or the Environmental Court. So I'm sympathetic to the developers about this, and I would like to see us restore the more informal process at the District Commission that does not involve lawyers. It's no party for citizens to have to participate in 2 full-blown cases either. The district commissions work best with no lawyers. Act 250 has always had the problem that well-funded applicants represented by lawyers and expert witnesses spend many months and sometimes years preparing their applications, and then citizens have to quickly scramble to figure out what is going on, what the proposed project is about, how to organize other interested people, and how to find and hire experts, raise money, and put on their case, all the while having to learn all the rules that apply to Act 250. I experienced this problem firsthand when in 2000 I was tasked with putting together a case that Vermont Public Radio dubbed the mother of all Act 250 cases because almost all the criteria were major issues. The applicant spent more than 4 years in preparation, and I found that there was little we could do except these little studies that I have mentioned, that I was trying to be judicious in how we spent money so that the information that we gathered on the natural resources, the herpetological species, the hydrogeology, the wetlands and botanical species, would be useful to my town whether or not the project went forward. But in terms of preparing the case, I was told that I would have to raise $250,000, but the project never filed, and so until they filed, I really couldn't do anything. I'm told by lawyers that a maximum of 6 months is necessary for major case preparation in response to a full application. And all these changes that are being proposed here are relevant to this project, which could come back. And I want to make sure that whatever is done, both for my community and for other communities, creates a system that is fair and doesn't just advantage the applicant and disadvantage the citizens. 5 years ago, I prepared a permit reform proposal. I brought it to the House Natural Resources and Energy Committee in January of 2015 to move land use issues from the Public Utility Commission to Act 250 because Vermont is the only state that has a Public Utility Commission that decides land use and because of the impossible public participation process at the PUC. Part of that proposal involved the creation of a 5-member state land use board. The VNRC administration proposal before you needs revisions to make it work. And in my 10 years of working with citizens at the PUC, some of you may recall, I was brought up in an investigation, a criminal investigation by the Attorney General's office, alleging that I was practicing law without a license for assisting citizens in participating in the legalistic process at the PUC. And while it went away in 19 days, it did cost me money. and so that there is a new PUC chair who is trying to improve the process for citizens, and he is holding informal discussions with all kinds of stakeholders. He held an informal discussion last year with pro se parties, and the PUC asked me to ask the people that participated, pro se, if they would either come in person or phone in and discuss it. And there were several dozen people. To a person, nobody would do it. One person who's actually a lawyer but participated pro se said, it was too painful, I never want to go back in that room again. Nobody would even phone in. So the word that's used for these very legalistic processes is frequently is brutal. And the citizens just get eaten alive. And I can give you an example of how it happens. You go in without a lawyer to a hearing. The lawyer for the applicant is very seasoned and well-versed in this, and they bring up some sort of rule that what you're doing doesn't comply with. And the citizen doesn't understand what that rule is, and they are immediately intimidated and shut down. It just, these legalistic processes do not work for citizens at all. The PUC is trying to, they've got a pilot project that's for mediation and facilitation, so I assisted some people in going through that. The mediation part of it was a problem because I can't talk to them about what happened in mediation, and I can't go into mediation with them, and I'm not a lawyer, and they get pressured without a lawyer in mediation and end up agreeing to things that they really shouldn't have agreed to. But so that, you know, you're talking about a legal process. And so I appreciate that the PUC is trying, but when it gets down to it, it's a legal process. Updating the process provides an opportunity to address the inequities about applicants and citizens. VCE supports eliminating environmental court except for enforcement and zoning appeals, as recommended by the VNRC administration proposal. We also support creating a state-level land use board to hear contested cases in the first instance, with appeals to the Vermont Supreme Court. However, there's still a necessary role for district commissions. One more comment on the PUC and this word inconsistency. I'm more concerned about the inconsistency between the land use decisions that the PUC is making and the land use decisions that are coming out of Act 250. There's no consistency whatsoever, and so we have this very sort of hypocritical land use decision making, which was why I thought it made sense to move the land use piece of it to the Act 250, which is actually a very good land use law with the criteria all very much relevant to the siting of solar panels and wind turbines and that sort of thing. Back to the district commissions. Absent the district commissions, what's being proposed is just like the PUC, which represents so many obstacles to citizen participation that few citizens and towns participate at all. It is litigation, and litigation means lawyers, and a preliminary scoping process will not fix that. The PUC has a preliminary process. They have a 45-day notice. When you get in that hearing room and you're up against lawyers, then there's no help for you. So now I'll take you through the proposal that I'm recommending to, if I can figure out how to turn this on.
Let me see it awoken.
To update Act 250 and the district commission process, perhaps as an option offered to parties instead of the current process, and additions that are necessary to make the state land use board work for all Vermonters, not just those represented by lawyers with financial resources. So this is the current district commission process. We have 3 commissioners and a district coordinator sitting on one side of the table. And then on the other side of the table, we have the applicant and the lawyer. Some applicants go through it by themselves and don't use lawyers, but most of them do. And then we have the citizens or the citizens with a lawyer. And this is a contested case. It is set up for parties to fight, like court. And that's how it's been used in a way that is not healthy for anyone, because that wasn't the original intention. So I'm proposing that we update the district commission process, and again, I'm saying this could be an option in addition to the current process, to create the opportunity to sit down and talk with no lawyers. And the first time that I came up with this idea was because I was watching at the Public Utility Commission that there must have been, I would say, I don't know how, I couldn't count how many lawyers and experts there were in the room on a 150 kilowatt project to decide where to plant trees for screening. That case probably cost $50,000 to $60,000. And that's what happens in these state level panels. This is very, very expensive litigation. And so I'm thinking, why can't we just create a place for people to sit down and talk? It's already in statute. It grants the authority to promote expeditious, informal, and non-adversarial resolutions of issues, require the timely exchange of information concerning the application, and encourage participants to settle differences. Now, this could be called the preliminary scoping process, but it could go much further. But it does restore the original intent of Act 250. And what this process would do as a stakeholder process would be this is how it would work. The applicant would file an application, notify potential parties. The district commission holds hearings. They recognize parties and grant party status. This is what district commissions are really good at. They're very good at identifying who the parties are, and it usually happens at the first part of a hearing, and it's like, what are your issues? You get a green piece of paper. You get to figure out what they are, and I see that that's certainly an important part to retain. And then a facilitator gets assigned. It could be trained district coordinators and commissioners. And so then the facilitator holds meetings with parties to work through the issues and agree to disagree. I've participated in a number of community-based stakeholder processes, one with OMIA, one with Agrimark, and I'm hearing that there's still more good things coming out of the Agrimark stakeholder process. Warren Coleman was in it. Stakeholder processes can be, everybody sits down together and says, we want to fight, we don't want to, there's nothing to work here. I mean, in my community, there's a whole contingent that says not one shovelful is going to come out of that mountain for this big project. And so that becomes clear very quickly. But in the OMIA stakeholder process, we all agreed, including the North American president of the company, to issue an RFP. We got 4 responses. We then had a meeting and interviewed 4 of the 6 respondents. We agreed on the experts to hire. It took 2 years, but it changed everything in the community, in the company. They made procedural process changes. In 2011, I went to a program at Harvard Law School that was sponsored by the Department of Energy because they were upset that wind developers were upsetting communities and not getting their projects built. And they were concerned that it would, that we weren't going to meet our goals. And so there were 100 people there, and it was facilitated by Lawrence Susskind, who is the guru of alternative dispute resolution. He's the founder of the Harvard University Alternative Dispute Resolution Program. Consensus Building Institute, he formed that. I had been in touch with their director over the last 5 years, actually even before that, asking if they would be willing to come and help with understanding and training people to do these community processes, and they're happy to do it. And when there was the Governor's Electric Generation Siting Commission back in, I think, 2011, Scott Johnstone actually was on that, and he got in touch with the people that I recommended, but nothing's ever come of it. The fact, and what we did for 3 days was learn about community-based stakeholder processes, and it was to teach the wind developers to do it differently. I've asked at least 4 or 5 wind developers, would you please do it differently? Because you're creating tremendous divisions in our communities. And to a person, they say, oh yes, we're all about community, and then they don't do it. And they go out and hire their usual experts. And so at the district commission process, there is an opportunity for people to explore to whatever level that they want to. It's not set in time frames, and as I said, there might just be one meeting. It might be very clear, this is going to fight, and this should then go up to the state level, to the state panel. So this is what it would look like with the region, and this is actually what was intended originally. Mark Blucher, whose father was one of the authors of Act 250, gave me a write-up that was written by John Marshall a few years after Act 250 came into place, and from that I understood that it was supposed to be a place where all the various parties sat together, the Regional Planning Commission, the towns, the abutters, the landowners, and discussed what are the issues and how can we deal with it. And all this requires is someone trained in facilitation. This is not mediation. It works best without lawyers. There would need to be some accommodation for applicants who want to have their lawyer in the room. There would need to be some accommodation for citizens groups who want to have other people in the room. That has not been an issue before, but this is not a confidential process, and this is a process that someone takes notes, and this all belongs at the regional level. Oops, sorry about that. So what happens after the community stakeholder process is that if all the issues are resolved, the district commission issues a decision on the merits and the case ends. For resolved issues, the district commission issues a decision on the merits. For the remaining unresolved issues, the district commission issues a report with results of a facilitated stakeholder process, and those issues move to the contested case de novo hearing at the new state land use board. And if there is no agreement on any issues, the district commission issues a report, and the process moves to the contested case heard by the new state land use board. The piece that's missing from the proposal by the administration is the necessity to provide citizen interveners with the resources to participate so that it creates a fair hearing and a full record for the board to make its decisions. New York State has an energy siting process called Article 10. They have intervener funding. I can send you their guidelines on how to do it. It's all laid out. It's not a huge amount of money. It's certainly not the $250,000 that I was told I would need to raise 15 years ago. But it is something that needs to happen, and it's only for experts. New Hampshire's process for citing energy projects is called the Site Evaluation Commission. And the Site Evaluation Commission it's not a standing committee. And so when an energy project of a certain size comes up, and Northern Pass was an example, there's a project called Antrim Wind that's gone through that twice, then what happens is that various people, like the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, appoint someone to sit on it. So each of the state agencies are represented. I went over a couple years ago to watch it, just to see what it looked like. It was a big hearing room. There were, 15 people sitting around that table hearing the case. And they have a process for, and it's not again, a full-time person, but a counsel for the public, and that counsel for the public then is there representing the interests of the citizens. And it's not out of their Office of Public Advocacy. Their current public advocate is Don Kreis, who used to be at Vermont Law School. I'm sure Don would be happy to talk about their process for how they go about choosing the counsel for the public. But absent these pieces, I mean, what I heard today about, there has to be some accommodation for pro se parties. That is not enough. Those are just words. Those don't mean anything when you're in a hearing with a lawyer who's, and I've seen it happen. The reason I'm up here today is for the most complicated PUC case anybody has ever seen, and it had a little argument today at the Supreme Court. Well, one of two cases that have both had 2 evidentiary hearings, so there have been 4 evidentiary hearings. And that developer is from New York City, and he has a record of litigating everywhere. He sued the town of Bennington, the Select Board, the Planning Commission, the Regional Planning Commission. They settled because they were brought to their knees. Now he's suing the adjoiner, he's suing the homeowners association, the original developer, the homeowner who doesn't live there, and the estate of a dead man. And you can't imagine what can happen. I mean, nobody could make this up. But it is a brutal process when it gets down to into the hands of the lawyers. And a lot of my friends are lawyers, not dissing lawyers here. I'm just saying that the process itself, when you have discovery, when you have depositions, when you have the ability to crush your opponent, that's what happens in these contested cases. And do not minimize the potential for that when you consider whether or not to give resources to the other side. And I remember a few years ago, I was in a store in Rutland, and the chair of that district commission saw me, and he said, who are you, Annette Smith? I said, yeah. And he said, I want you to know that what you do is really important, because so often we are faced with an applicant and there's nobody on the other side. And we really need that kind of balance in order for us to get the information that we need. So I am recommending that when there is a contested case between the five-member land use board, that the applicant, which always has an economic interest in making money, and the public, who often say, look, all we're trying to do is maintain the status quo. We have nothing to gain here except that what's being proposed is going to dramatically affect our lives, our property values, our local environment. It has to be a fair fight, and it has to be one that is funded. And I think that the amounts of money are still not, that I'm suggesting are still not enough, but you have got to give people a lawyer. Because without a lawyer in these board cases, then don't recreate the same nightmare at the Public Utility Commission. So that's my piece on this, and then I have just 3 other things I'm going to cover, but I don't know if you want to ask me any questions about this before I move on.
Does the committee have questions on this? I don't know what, I mean, you have 3 other things. We also have other out-of-town.
I'm just going to touch on a couple of things.
Okay. Because we
and I'm moving, as I said, I'm going to end with the Slate Quarry.
Yep. 5 more minutes.
So I've provided you with a document on, let's see, how do I do this? All right. Mark, how do I get
slide,
to
just hold and slide over?
Slide sideways.
It's not working. All right, maybe I have to go to the first page and then slide over. Oh, the wrong way. Okay, sorry. Okay, thanks. So I want to go the other way. Back to. Okay, great. So this general criteria for the selection of mountain protected areas. I just want to provide you with this because it's probably the best single piece I've seen when you think about ridgeline protections. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to the language on the second page, which is these 2 points, which, having done a lot of work on ridgeline and mountains and understanding a lot of hydrogeology issues that I've had to work on over the years, that these probably are the 2 most important points. To accommodate climate change in order to protect biodiversity, mountain protected areas should be extended down slopes to the lowlands, not just a couple hundred feet from the ridgeline, but all the way down. And in view of the increasingly critical high-quality water shortage, mountain headwaters are particularly desirable sites for land and water protection. We saw the headwaters in Sheffield and in Lowell sacrificed. The permits don't cover those areas at all, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Department was expressing great concerns about it, and the person who was expressing concerns was moved to another job. It's time to come back and protect our headwaters and to recognize that what we have in Vermont here with our water is really, really valuable. And I'm not terribly concerned about our demographics right now the way most people are, because I think that with what's happening on our planet, that more and more people are going to be coming to Vermont. And one reason is because we have, compared to everywhere else, pure water. It may not be that pure, but it's still, we have something here that is going to, as things are changing, we are going to have more people coming here for that. On ridgelines, I know that Ed Stanek has done a lot of work on the details of what it would look like to change the standard from 2,500 feet to 1,500 feet, and I strongly recommend that you hear from him. And I also recommend that whatever changes that you make in the criteria, that you give a directive to the Public Utility Commission to incorporate. And I would like you to consider removing the ability of the Public Utility Commission to find that the public good overrules the Act 250 determination that there is an undue adverse impact. We have an example of it at Deerfield Wind. Attorneys told me that it sent shockwaves through the legal community when the PUC allowed for destruction of critical bear habitat that the Agency of Natural Resources opposed. And yet the PUC said, well, the public good of the region is more important. And so the bear habitat was fragmented on 2 ridge lines that are in a very remote area, and it was the finest bear habitat in the state. So now I'll go to slate quarry regulation, and I have one thing to say and 2 documents to look at. So I have been a proponent of a stakeholder process with the slate quarries. And I have met with the neighbors last summer, and I met with the quarriers, about half a dozen of them, some of whom are here today. And previously I'd met with one who's here today. I have sympathy for the slate quarry industry, and note that they are unique in the extraction business compared to all the other industries in Vermont. The result of my meeting with the various entities was that I no longer think that a stakeholder process is a good idea. There is a lot of animosity between the neighbors and the quarriers, which I believe could be overcome, and in fact that can build trust in a stakeholder process. But what I also observed, and you've heard this before, is that the slate quarriers are not all on the same page. Some don't want any regulation, some are quite willing to have limited regulation, and so the way I left it, and I could see a stakeholder process actually turning into a fight amongst them. I just think it would be counterproductive, and people are pressed for time, and I'm not sure that in their industry they would have the time to put into what it would take. Just scheduling meetings would be a challenge, but I just don't think it's a good idea. But what I did leave them with was, would you look at some existing Act 250 permit that does regulate a slate quarry? Would you look at what you might be willing to live with in terms of regulation? I've been open to the idea of something like Act 250 light, and I had hoped that I would have been able to have some back and forth with them and bring you something that we all agreed on, but I didn't hear from them again. And so what I'm bringing you today, okay, got it. Okay, so I've brought 2 documents to you. This Act 250 9E Guidance for Completing an Earth Extraction Plan, Blasting Plan, and Reclamation Plan for Act 250 projects is what every other aggregate extraction quarry in the state has to go through when they go through Act 250. And so I saw in the spreadsheet last week that what was in there was notification. That's not enough. And so you could take notification and add to it, or you could take this and start crossing things out. And again, I wish that we had been able to do that so that we would have spared you all the committee time of looking at this, but this is what is now required of any other extraction business. Some of the issues of the slate quarriers are that as you've heard them say, they have a challenge economically with competition. They also have they get orders for certain types of rock. But I will also say that there are very real issues for the neighbors, and it is time to put some regulation into place. The neighbors discovered this other federal law, and this federal law actually should be applied right now, and it never has been, because there is no state regulation. So I'm not sure that it's doing the quarriers any favor to not have regulation. So again, I'm showing you 2 documents about what are kind of normal when you're dealing with blasting and extraction industries. So on the request of a resident or owner of a man-made dwelling or structure located within 1/2 mile, that they can ask for a pre-blast survey. That's not being done right now. Public notice, there should be a public notice about blasting, and I'm not going to read all this, but I did put it in some of the highlights in red. And then there are other things about the hours. Blasting can be only during daytime hours. I've heard of stories of somebody blasting at 2 p.m. 2 a.m. And so just know that there's already federal law around these things, and between these two documents, this committee should be able to find, and with the input of the Slate quarriers, should be able to find something that meets the needs of the quarriers and also meets the needs of the neighbors. But it is not okay for somebody to just come in and open up an old quarry next to a house. In fact, this says that blasting shall not be conducted within 1,000 feet of any building used as dwelling, school, church, hospital, or nursing facility. You just need some rules. So I think that there is a reasonable approach to this, but something needs to change so that the neighbors have some assurances about quality of life. And on the mapping, I actually was the one who sent the information to the GIS people because the NRB said they didn't have time for it. So I was really pleased to hear that 90% of that is done. And I don't think I'll be able to stay to hear that, but I do appreciate that. I did get a call this past summer from someone looking to buy a house near Lake St. Catherine. And she wanted to know about slate quarries. And I said, well, the only way to find out if there's anything near where you want to is to, and I sent her all the files, because I have them in zip files. And so a map is at least reasonable. They chose not to buy property on Lake St. Catherine because of the unknowns. So it is affecting the local real estate market too. So on that,
Thank you.
thank you very much.
Drive safely in that. Thank you.
Well, hopefully there's not going to be ice over Killington, but you just never know. Right.
Right, we're really late. We have folks who also need to drive home. So, next up. Diane Snelling. Under the wire to get Diane, who needs to leave. Probably catch a bus.
Yeah, I don't think I'll even take 15 minutes. For the record, Diane Snelling, Chair of the Natural Resources Board. And I believe I was asked to talk about slate quarry mapping. And I think you're going to have Ryan Knox here to show you what the status of the maps are, and that 90% of mapping came from materials that were collected previously. And so I am hoping that we can get the 10% done, and certainly one of the reasons we didn't move forward after your letter was that we looked at our capacity to do to organize a stakeholder process and knew that we couldn't without some funding, and I tried very hard to get the dollars to finish the mapping and wasn't able to do that. So I do think you'll be happy to see what exists now, which, as I said, is 90% of the total, and should give a very good way to have a conversation with both residents and slate quarriers, and have just be able to visually see exactly what's close to what, and I hope would also bring in the conversation with town zoning, because I think you could do a lot with town zoning. But I guess most of all I would like to say to you, please be thoughtful about this. It's been 25 some odd years, and I don't think we need to be in a big hurry to change it. So I hope you'll give some time to look at the maps and try to think through from that perspective.
How much more money do you need to finish the 10%?
It's very little. I would say like under 5,000.
Oh, that is very little.
It is. I mean, but in the scheme of things,
Yeah. Matt's gonna raise money
we
for it.
run very lean, and so. Are there any questions?
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, coming up to the Slate Quarry, you guys. Yeah, I figure you stay for him anyway. I know you have to drive back to Rutland County. So. Okay, if that's a good idea, Mr. Knox. Are you Mr. Knox?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I'm Ryan Knox.
We were gonna skip ahead to you.
All right, sounds good. I printed out some maps, there's maybe 10 copies. I didn't realize there would be so many people in the committee. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ryan.
Sure. My name's Ryan Knox. I'm a GIS professional for the Agency of Natural Resources. I just help our scientists, biologists, foresters, with technology, and I guess this project, thank you for showing that. I'm just gonna, if you don't mind just taking one and pass it along.
Yeah, sure.
Diane's right, roughly about 90% of the work is done. Back in 2016, beginning of 2016, I work one day a week at the Rutland District Office, and Bill Burke is there, and he's the district coordinator, so we started talking about these exemptions. And I said, well, hey, if you put together the materials, we'll try to, when I say the materials, I mean like the registrations, the actual registrations. So Joyce Fagan at the time collected all that stuff and provided it to me.